Norby, you can start.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar entitled Political Demography of South Korea, Generational Conflicts, Gender Politics, Regionalism, and Anti-Americanism and Netizens. I am Norby Salonga.
And I am Giselle Laguna, and we are your moderators for this webinar. As a gentle reminder, here are our house rules. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A window below. It will be visible to all participants, and you may choose to be anonymous. The webinar will be recorded for documentation purposes. And kindly take note of this one: for those who will send rude, inappropriate questions or messages, the hosts reserve the right to remove such participants. And with that, thank you for waking up early and joining us this morning. So how are you, Norby?
I am good, Giselle, and hello to our audience. I am truly excited to learn more about the political demography of South Korea. I am sure that our audience is equally excited to learn from this webinar. How about you, Giselle?
Yes, same with you, Norby. I'm also looking forward to understanding how age, gender, and social class affect voting behavior in South Korea.
That's correct. We'll also learn how regionalism, inter-Korean relations, internet politics, and anti-Americanisms have influenced the outcomes of presidential and parliamentary elections.
Right. Lastly, the political effects of extremely low fertility rate, rapid population aging, interregional migration, and rising immigration will also be explained later.
Wow, this is such a fully loaded session. To start off, may I call on Dr. Antoinette Raquiza, Professor and Assistant to the Dean for Public Affairs of the UP Asian Center, to deliver the opening remarks on behalf of Dean Sevilla.
Good morning. Welcome to today's public lecture entitled Political Demography of South Korea: Generational Conflicts, Gender Politics, Regionalism, Anti-Americanism, and Netizens. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Oi Hang Shin, visiting research fellow at the Asia Center, Seoul National University. South Korea has come a long way since it distinguished itself as one of the world's fastest growing economies in the 1960s onward, a historic feat that other industrializing countries in the region then set a distinct development pattern of state-led capitalism. This pattern, however, is also distinct in another sense by challenging the democratization theory that links economic growth with a rising demand from citizens for greater political democracy. Today's talk examines what are the structural constraints contributing to South Korea's stunted democratic process, and it examines the tension between the country's traditional sociopolitical culture and its changing demography. On behalf of Dean Henelito Sevilla Jr. and the Asian Center, I'd like to thank Dr. Shin for being our guest lecturer on this important topic. As the Philippines confronts similar challenges of rapid growth and intensifying political polarization, there is much to learn from the South Korean experience. Thank you also to Dr. Michelle Palumbarit and our Information Office for organizing the webinar, and for everyone who has tuned in this morning. Maraming salamat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kiza, for your opening remarks.
Thank you also, Norby and Giselle.
No problem, ma'am. Thank you po.
Dr. Rakisa. All right, let me introduce our distinguished speaker this morning. Shin is a distinguished professor emeritus in the Department of Sociology, University of South Carolina in Columbia, and a visiting research fellow of Asia Center, Seoul National University. He was an invited professor of SNU from 2005 to 2014 and Sun Kyung Kwan University from 2014 to 2019.
He received BA in Sociology from Seoul National University in 1964, MA in Demography from University of Pennsylvania in 1968, and Ph.D. in Demography from the same university, University of Pennsylvania in 1971. His areas of interest are the political demography of Korea and international higher education.
He has published nearly 70 articles in journals such as Amerasia Journal, American Educational Research Journal, American Sociologist, Asian Survey, Behavioral Science, Demography, East Asia and International Quarterly, and International Journal of Korean Studies, among others. Without further ado, let us all welcome Professor Ken Shin.
Thank you, Novi and Giselle. And I also would like to thank Dean Rakisa for thoughtful introductory remark for this webinar. And in addition, I would like to thank Michelle for organizing this webinar this day, today. Now, in my presentation, as Dean indicated in her remarks, I will focus on this phenomenon that, in one hand, Korea has reached advanced level of industrialization and economic development. In one hand, in terms of maturity of democratic political system, I feel Korea has a long way to go. So what are the factors that may have impacted this status inconsistency of South Korea in terms of the gap between economic development and political system? And that would be my talk's central theme. And I would argue the legacy of political culture has been obstacle to the development of South Korean political system. So in my model, political development, political outcomes will be the consequences or effects, whereas population factors, demographic dynamics will be my independent variables or causes. So you will hear in my talk how generation, gender, social stratification, regional sentiment, and anti-Americanism influence political outcomes in South Korea. By the way, do you see my PowerPoint slide, Novi?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, great. So in terms of the sequence of my talk, I will first discuss this effects of continuous decline in birth rate and rapid aging of the population and increasing immigration on political system in South Korea. This demographic transition, demographic shift, I would argue, drastically changed the composition of voting age population, particularly the generational or age makeup of the voters. And then I will talk about voter participation rates and variations in voting rate by generation, gender, and the voting behaviors, variation by social class. Then Korea has been recognized as one of the leading countries in terms of the use of broadband, internet, and how this cyber politics, internet use influenced the political processes in South Korea. Historically, Korea had to deal with this regional animosity, regional conflict, particularly between two regions in the peninsula. That is to say, between southwest and southeastern region, and how this regional animosity influenced the political processes. That I will explain. I will also discuss anti-American sentiments in South Korea and how this anti-Americanism came about and how it has influenced political development. Then in the last part of my talk, I will discuss 2022 presidential election in South Korea, who are running in the race and what are the campaign issues and some current polls on these major candidates. Okay, and that's the organization of my talk this morning. So let me then get into this demographic factors that influenced the voting age population in South Korea. As you see from this chart, there has been a continuing and sharp decline in birth rate. When my cohort was growing up in South Korea in 1950s, the average number of children per family was something like 6.2. Now, as of 2020, the total fertility rate, that is the number of children per family, is below 1.0. And it would take a little bit more than 2.1 total fertility rate for a given population to be replaced. But in South Korea, for last 20-some years, it went below the replacement level and showed one of the lowest fertility rate in the world. So this drastic decline in birth rate led to smaller cohort size for younger age groups. So we used to have a typical pyramid shape age structure. Now it's becoming more barrel type or even upside down pyramid shape age structure. In addition, South Korea has been experiencing the increasing influx of immigrants, documented as well as undocumented foreign resident population in South Korea. This 2.5 million is legal residents. If we add undocumented residents, it would be substantially greater. We have also experienced increasing marriage immigration to South Korea. And China is one of the major country of origin in terms of sending immigrants in relation to marriage. Vietnam, Japan, and Philippines would be ranked number 4. And as we you see from the trend between 2011 to 2019, the number of marriage immigrants to South Korea has been increasing considerably. Okay. So as of 2020, about 11% of total marriages happening in South Korea are multicultural marriages, especially between Korean men and international female partners. Okay. So what has been happening is that at elementary and middle schools in South Korea today, the proportion of students who are from multicultural families are considerable, near 7 to 8%, depending upon regions of South Korea. So this multicultural population would have political voice down the road, particularly when these young cohorts reach voting age. Due to this continuing and sharp decline of birth rate, we have observed this increasing share of the voting age population by 50 and older. On the other hand, the voters under age 40 losing its share within that voting age population category. So nearly 1/2 of the total voting age population in South Korea today are 50 and older folks. And I would argue that transition in the makeup of a voting age population would have a profound implication for South Korea's political development. That is to say, when all the voters have more political muscle, then candidates running for public offices, all the way up president to local councils, they have to come up with the campaign promises which would satisfy the demand and expectation of these 50 and older voters. So some pundits they came up with this concept, silver democracy, the elderly voters having a lot of voice in the political process due to the rapid decline in birth rate and rising median age and rapid process of aging of the population. Korea, South Korea showed one of the highest voter turnout rate in the world. In the last presidential election, as you see from these figures, voter turnout rate for total population, voting age population, was nearly 77%. Okay. And as I pointed out, in terms of the percent share of the total voting age population by 50 and older, in absolute number, the 50 and older voters have a lot of say in election. At the same time, as you can tell from this voter turnout rate, 50 and older got considerably higher voter participation rate than voters under age 50. The voter participation rate for parliamentary election would be considerably lower than that for presidential election over the years. Nevertheless, these parliamentary election voting rate, comparatively speaking, is substantially higher than, say, parliamentary election voting rate in United States and even many other industrialized, highly economically developed countries in Europe. In particular, this voter turnout rate for 50 and older, even in parliamentary election, being higher than 70%. It's a world record, not in the entire world, but at least a substantial portion of the world. Okay. In the past, women voters had slightly lower voter participation rate in both presidential and parliamentary election. But in recent elections, starting with the 2012 presidential election, it got reversed. In 2012, Park Geun-hye, the first female president ever in South Korean political history and daughter of the President Park Chung-hee, the dictator in the 70s and 80s, successfully ran for president. And that triggered a sharp increase in women's voting rate. And it stayed higher than male counterparts voter turnout rate in 2017 presidential election. Although that is not necessarily the case in parliamentary election. It is interesting to remind ourselves that all the cliche has been that women tended to be most critical toward other women in almost everything. However, in political elections, that may not be true, and we have observed that evidence in 2012 South Korean presidential election. In parliamentary election, the last National Assembly member election, April 2020, we have seen some interesting development in that the younger newly eligible voters, particularly the voters at age 18 and 19, showed a higher voting rate than some of their older brothers and sisters, 22 39 age group. So that was an impressive, refreshing development in South Korean voting behavior. This 18-year-old became eligible to vote for the first time in 2020 National Assembly election. So I guess that historical moment motivated these new young voters get actively involved in political process, in this case, National Assembly member election. Once again, the female voters showed, in most age groups, higher voting rate than their male counterpart. That was another interesting development. So to make a long story short, about the generational politics, political demographers categorize the South Korean voting age group into two major groups. Those who got involved in this process of rapid economic development and industrialization, so-called industrialization generation, who were in the cohort of post-war baby boom, and they are in their late 50s and 60s and older in terms of age. And then the younger cohorts who were in front for political activism and struggle for democracy in the 1980s as a college students. The Koreans call them 386 generation. They were born in 1960s, and they went through their college education in 1980s, and they were very much politically sensitized and actively involved in the movement for democratization. Now they are in their 50s, so from 386 generation, the labeling changed to 586 generation, and they became the political elites under this progressive administration of President Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, as well as the current president, President Moon Jae-in. So this younger cohorts of voters in South Korean population, so-called Generation X, these are the cohort members who were not actively involved in the struggle for democracy. They were born, most of them were born afterwards, although some of them were young kids in the 70s. And they enjoy this affluent life condition, because by the time they were growing up as a young kids, South Korean economy reached affluent and one of the rapidly developing economy of the world, and therefore they, in a way, had a different life history to compare with the previous cohorts. Nevertheless, they experienced this so-called financial crisis, financial meltdown, which started in 1997. Therefore, they had two diametrically opposing situations they had to deal with. Affluent life condition coming from this rapid industrialization and economic development in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s. Then all of a sudden they witnessed this financial meltdown. This may have led them to become very materialistic and very much conspicuous, consumption-oriented. And this generation X, I would also consider first South Korean cohort who got fully exposed to the use of internet. All the cohorts already completed their educational training stages, but this generation X spend their elementary, middle, high school, and college days utilizing this internet fully. Therefore, they are very much familiar with using this emerging internet technology and actively participate in social network system, even their participation in political debates and political mobilization. In addition, this generation Y, those cohorts succeeded generation X, they are more skilled in internet use, and their involvement in internet politics would be greater and more active than the previous cohort, generation X. At the same time, they spend a lot of time, as some of my students do, computer games, internet games, and so on. So it cuts both ways, I should say. Now, as I pointed out, there was a very significant shift in the makeup of the voting age population over the years. And one very significant change or transition was the fact that 50 and older voters now share nearly 1/2 of the total voting age population, whereas voters under age 40, their share got sharply declined. 2002 and 2012 presidential election gave us an opportunity to do some cohort analysis of the voting behaviors. In particular, in 2002, Progressive Party candidate No Mu-hyun got elected, defeating the Conservative Party candidate Lee Hae-chung. On the other hand, in 2012, Progressive Party candidate Moon Jae-in lost the race to Park Geun-hye, the Conservative Party candidate. The point I'm trying to make is that there was a 10-year difference between two elections. So those who were in 20 to 29 age group and who voted progressive candidate Roh Moo-hyun would be 30 to 39 10 years later, and 30 to 39 would be 40 to 49. So if we compare these figures diagonally, we are essentially tracing the cohort's behavior in voting. Whether that cohort stay progressive, or as they get older, they become more conservative. Okay. What I found from this analysis, when voters get older, although they previously voted for progressive candidate, they tended to change substantially by supporting conservative candidate, although not all of them, but substantial segment of each and every cohort show that kind of becoming conservative as voters get older. That was a very rare opportunity for political demographer to do a cohort analysis. The last presidential election had the current president Moon Jae-in running again after losing to Park Geun-hye 5 years ago, and he defeated conservative candidate Hong Jun-pyo by substantial margin, 41.1% to 24%. But I should note that the opposition group had multiple candidates. So if opposition group had a unified front and only a single candidate representing that conservative group, the outcome would have been quite different. Although it's hard to tell after the fact how much that split of opposition group led to election of President Moon Jae-in. But in light of the past political history of presidential election in South Korea, split within the opposition group gave the ruling party candidate pulling it off at the end. That was the pattern of the years. And last presidential election was no exception at all. And I will point out this possibility again, 2022 presidential election, March next year. There was an interesting development in South Korean politics, which was correlated with the Me Too movement. Starting around the later part of 2018, this Me Too movement got into full swing in South Korea. And many well-known figures in South Korean politics, as well as in different sectors of society, had this problems of allegation in that they harassed or abused sexually their female colleagues and female subordinates and female staff members. One very tragic case had to do with Seoul Mayor Park Won-sun. He was a highly respected leader of movement for democracy and civil rights in the South Korean political history. And he organized citizen groups, especially People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, which became the leading citizens organization in South Korea. And that PSPD had a huge influence in citizens' movement for democracy. He was elected by a landslide in mayoral election, but only 2020, one of Mayor Park's female staff reported that Mayor Park sexually harassed her, and that allegation led Mayor Park to commit suicide. So there was a by-election of Seoul mayor in April 7, 2020, and a female candidate of the Democratic Party ran against the Conservative Party candidate Oh. And as you see here, Oh got elected with a substantial margin of support in that election. So my point here is that South Korean voters' voting behavior is quite fluid, depending upon the policy measures and ethics and moral issues of their political figure or political party. The voters' tendency would change drastically overnight. And this is a compelling evidence supporting that argument. I would like to note that once again, the older the age group of voters, the tendency of supporting a conservative candidate is quite strong. And even younger voters under age 40 supported the Conservative Party candidate. Oh. Nevertheless, the voters in the age group 40 to 49 had a greater support for the Liberal Progressive Party candidate in this mayoral election. And we will observe this somewhat unique voting behavior of those in their 40s. Okay. They tended to support the ruling party, and they have shown things been going well. Why rock the boat kind of attitude in one election after another. So they are the ones who benefited from this life conditions of South Korea. And they are at that life cycle stage where they have secure employment, and they have their own residence. So they seem to be, relatively speaking, to compare with other age group voters, are happy with the current condition, their life condition, as well as they have a positive perspective about the political condition in general. So that's somewhat interesting variation. Okay. There are some gender difference in voting behavior in a given age. As I said, in younger age groups under 40, support for a Conservative Party candidate was very obvious. But once again, there was a gender difference. One caveat was that female voters under age 30, they went for Park. This, as I said, Park was a former National Assembly member, and also she was a cabinet member. So woman voting for a woman candidate was one possible factor. However, that pattern was not repeated for women in their 40s, although they supported more Park than younger age group of women in their 30s. So women voters supporting women candidate in younger age groups again appeared in mayoral race. In political demography, we focus on how the social class influence of voting behavior. The traditional priori would suggest that working class voters and low middle class voters tended to support progressive party candidates, whereas upper middle and upper class voters would go with the Conservative Party candidates. Then the middle class voters would have a casting vote, depending upon how the middle class decide to vote in a given election, would have a huge impact on final outcome of the election. Historically, the South Korean middle class has been opportunistic. For example, during the era of authoritarian military regime of President Park Chung-hee, the great majority of South Korean middle class enjoyed the rapid improvement in standard of living. Therefore, although young labor union leaders, student groups, and church groups organized movement for democratization, middle class were not directly actively involved in that struggle for democracy. Because they were benefiting from this rapid economic development and industrialization in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. However, by late 1980s, South Korean middle class recognized that time has come to get actively involved in political process, and the authoritarian military regime must end. That's the historical background of the political behavior of South Korean middle class. And that legacy remained intact for even the period after democratization by 1987, or at least 1992, when the first civilian president got elected. I would like to use this political map of Seoul, which showed Seoul mayoral election results by district. 2018, in which Park Won-sun had a landslide victory over Conservative Party candidate. He carried 22 districts out of 25. Only 3 districts he did not carry, or affluent neighborhood. Okay, Yongsan area and then Gangnam area, where the conservative candidate outvoted Progressive Party candidate. But 3 years later, after the sex scandal of that sitting mayor, what happened? The conservative candidate won every single district of Seoul, 25. He carried 25 out of 25. My point here is this. As I indicated as a priori regarding the social class and voting behavior, the rich folks tended to vote for Conservative Party candidate, and working class and low middle class voters would support liberal or progressive party and their candidates. But that social class and voting behavior, the correlation could change depending upon this moral issues. In this case, the former mayor was charged with uh, sexual harassment allegation. So that could change the voting behavior by social class. That's I will comment on social class and political attitude a little bit more in other contexts later. Okay. One data I would like to share with you has to do with the approval rating of the sitting president Moon Jae-in over last 3.5 years. Okay. President Moon had extremely high approval rating during the first year of his presidency. Nearly 3/4 of voters supporting him. Then his approval rating started to suffer, decline sharply ever since. Then he recovered considerably around spring of 2020. And that was primarily due to President Moon's and his administration's policy measures containing the spread of COVID-19 pandemic was key issue from which President Moon benefited. President Moon and his administration adopted very effective tracing, testing, and social distancing policy at the beginning of this spread of coronavirus in 2020. And that was the reason why such a high approval rating. Then all sorts of problems got developed, including that COVID-19 pandemic issue. Media started to report that President Moon and his administration failed to secure the vaccines sufficiently and soon enough. So his approval rating took a nosedive. In addition, the political scandal of his cabinet members, including his Justice Minister, Cho Guk, hurt his popularity. And he is dealing with a very low approval rating in the 30s now. So this approval rating of President Moon may have significant political implication for the next presidential election, which is less than 90 days from today. This polls examined why President Moon had such an impressive approval rating. Then his approval rating declined sharply over the last year and a half. As I indicated, the measures his administration adopted to control COVID-19 pandemic was one of the reasons why the respondents of these polls gave him high marks. And the policies for international relations and inter-Korean relations as well were another brownie points Moon Jae-in earned. And the welfare policies President Moon pushed also another contributing factor for positive assessment of President Moon. On the other hand, this policies on housing market, that is to say, a rapid, sharp increase in price of housing price. And citizens felt that President Moon and his administration failed to control the rising housing price. Another negative assessment of President Moon's policy had to do with this raising minimum wage, as well as income-led growth policy. Okay. South Korea has a quite unique makeup of the industry and workforce. Nearly 27% of economically active population are engaged in small businesses. Owners of small businesses employed in small businesses, including this corner shops, restaurants, cafes, and so on. And markets. So this raising minimum wage influence these small business owners in that they were not able to afford to keep their employees. Okay, with this nearly 30% increase in minimum wage within a couple of years. So they had to let their employees go, and their businesses suffered due to this minimum wage hike. And as I indicated earlier, his personnel decisions recruiting cabinet ministers and high positions in his administration were very negatively evaluated and criticized by media and citizen groups due to the fact that some of them had scandals. And that also led to the sharp drop in President Moon's approval rating. We see another interesting age variation in assessing President Moon and his administration. First of all, 50 and older folks tended to disapprove President Moon and his administration's policies. Likewise, voters under age 40, they disapprove as well. But once again, voters in their 40s, 40 to 49 age bracket, unlike other age groups, 57% approve President Moon. I explained earlier why that age group tended to manifest quite different political perspective to compare with the younger and older voters. As I said, they are the ones who have a comfortable life condition in terms of job security, housing, family, and so on and so forth. So they are happy with their current life situation, and they don't want any drastic changes in political system or political leadership come about. So that 40s to 49 age group showed quite interesting political attitude. Okay. Both male and female showed greater disapproval than the approval. However, disapproval percentage among male group was greater than their female counterpart. In terms of gender and political perspective, the traditional argument would be that male voters tended to be more concerned about economy, national security, international affairs, while the female voters would consider community safety, social welfare, education and ethics and values of political leaders would be top priority issues for them. So that kind of gender differences in political perspective we would come across in the literature. That may be true to a certain extent in South Korean politics. Now, in terms of occupation of voters, regardless the occupational status, disapproval rating is substantially higher than approval rating. But interesting fact was that unlike the total female voters, when we consider full-time homemaker, they have a more disapproval than the female population at large. So that's an interesting kind of fact. But I would guess that full-time homemakers are fully aware of the real economic condition. They feel it day in, day out, whenever they go to the market, whenever they consider moving to another place of residence. So they may have a more pragmatic, realistic assessment of the current administration. In terms of social class and assessment of President Moon and his administration, disapproval is observed across the board, regardless the social class status, upper middle, middle, low middle, and low class. Okay. Again, the middle class folks have somewhat lower disapproval rating than other social class, and that may be due to the similar factors which I indicated when I focused on this 40 to 49 age group. Their life condition is relatively stable, and therefore they consider no need for drastic change in political leadership, not as much as other social class group. Particularly, look at this, the lower class folks have a much lower approval rating. Okay, and that may be coming from the sentiment that their life suffering is largely due to the failure of effective political leadership, particularly economic policies of the current administration. Another gender difference within the same age group appeared once again. Okay? That is, the females and males in the 40s have a somewhat higher approval rating for Moon Jae-in than other age groups. I indicated earlier that South Korea is ranked one of the top 10 countries in the world in terms of accessibility to broadband, as well as use of the internet. Okay. And this, the availability of access to broadband and internet had a profound impact on political processes of South Korea in recent years. Koreans are extremely good at using SNS, Twitter, Facebook, and smartphones. And they are utilizing this SNS system for their political activism and political participation, including participation in the mass street demonstration against or for certain political parties, issues, and political leaders. Okay. You may recall this Arab Spring, so-called Jasmine Revolution in 2010 and 2011. Young cohorts in the Middle East and North African countries, including Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and Syria, organize mass political protest against this authoritarian regimes in their country at that point in time. One of the major mechanism involved in that political protest was use of internet, SNS system, and mobile phones. Without such a SNS use, this large-scale and quick mobilization of young folks hitting the street for pro-democracy protests would not have been possible. And even before this Arab Spring political revolution, South Koreans have adopted this SNS system for political activism starting around 2000, and ever since it has been very powerful political mechanism for South Korean citizens to get actively involved in political protest and political movement. I would like to show you this very contrasting SNS network. This Park Won-sun was the mayor of Seoul who committed suicide due to that sexual harassment allegation. But before that scandal came along, he was a very successful and highly respected leader of citizens organization and also mayor of Seoul. This Twitter network showed his campaign for mayoral election in 2018. As a liberal or progressive party candidate, he used the Twitter system at maximum level. And he had the so-called influencer, well-known writer, professor, even some entertainer and political figures in his Twitter network. And they were tweeting, retweeting, and exchanging various information and spreading the support of his candidacy for mayor. On the other hand, his opponent, Conservative Party candidate Na Kyung-won, also highly respected National Assembly member. And yet she had a very limited social network system. Pundits pointed out that younger, progressive Twitter users or SNS users tended to register their own view on internet, and then they exchange their views and follow up and tweet, retweet, and repeat that exchange of views on different issues. But in the cases of conservative group, they tended to not only use less Twitter network or SNS in general, but they just post their opinion and that's it. They don't follow up and retweet or exchange views with and comment on other folks posting. So that's why there was in one argument landslide victory for Park Won-sun in that mayoral election in 2018. There are dark sides of internet politics. A lot of social media manipulation of public opinion attempted in political election by this Twitter and SNS users. In South Korean election law, political campaign using internet is illegal. However, the citizens are using internet system, SNS system to spread even fake news and manipulating and attempting to manipulate public opinion on candidates, positive or negative. And this manipulation of public opinion using social media, we can find compelling evidence for it, that a very small number of accounts or manipulators use this automatic duplication system and posted and actively involved in tweets, like 13 accounts amounting to 9 million tweets. And that kind of illegal activities were found in 2017 presidential election. And one of the President Moon Jae-in's trusted inner circle colleague or member, inner circle member, Kim Kyung-soo, was charged with abusing this internet illegally and manipulate public opinion by this automatic duplication of positive comments on Twitter and SNS system. So Kim Kyung-soo was governor of the Gyeongnam province, but he was tried and he was sentenced to a jail term, and he had to resign from his governorship because of this court ruling that he was guilty of violating South Korean election law, campaign law. So internet, as I said, has positive dimensions which pushed political activism and political dialogue and debate in one hand, and this manipulation of public opinion through this social media system also being found in South Korean politics. So it cuts both ways. Another major problem with the internet politics, in addition to this manipulation of public opinion, negative campaign. South Korean political process showed this tendency of character assassination, spreading fake news, all sorts of negative campaigns. And that was extremely unfortunate situation in that debate on policies, campaign promises proposed by candidates would be secondary. This issues raised in the fake news and negative campaigns and questioning moral characters of candidates become the primary campaign issue, not the policy proposals. However, South Korean political system have not been able to come up with effective measures to control this internet use for negative campaigns and fake news spread. I am running out. I guess I ran out of my allotted time. Norby, Giselle, may I have just 5 more minutes before, or may I have a little bit more time to comment on the remaining slides, or what would be your recommendation? Norby, Giselle?
Yes, sir. I think 5 to 10 minutes is okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you, sir.
Let me then skip this regionalism, other than just the facts related to my argument that throughout the history of presidential election in South Korea, there was a very clear-cut East-West split. The eastern regions being stronghold for Conservative Party candidate, whereas Western region, particularly southwestern provinces, were the power base of Liberal Progressive Party candidate. And that regional split in voting for presidential election remained intact throughout the history of South Korean presidential election. In 2017, President Park Geun-hye, who defeated President then presidential candidate Moon Jae-in, was impeached due to political influence meddling scandal. So in 2017 presidential election, Moon Jae-in won. And as this 2017 election results show, the Conservative Party lost its support base completely, other than just a couple of provinces. So in a way, in terms of this long-standing regional rivalry, regional animosity ended with the 2017 presidential election. That was happy news, but recent development seems to rekindle, revive that old split pattern, which I will talk about later. And let me skip this and move on to concerning the public opinion on inter-Korean relations and possible reunification of Korean Peninsula. I would just report that support for unification is pretty weak. And nearly 1/2 of the South Korean population would say unification is not necessarily necessary at this point in time. And in terms of age, the younger the age group, the greater the sentiment, the negative sentiment about unification issue. And primary reason for not supporting unification is the possible economic burden after the unification. Anyway, inter-Korean relations did impact political outcome, particularly presidential election result. In the past, the military regimes and even some civilian government tried to use the North Korean threat to motivate South Korean voters to support their party and their candidates. Okay. Likewise, the South Korea-US alliance, the Progressive Party tried to push independent foreign policies, whereas the Conservative Party supported South Korea-US alliance more. In recent years, the US lost its status as primary a trade partner of South Korea. It used to be #1 export and import destination and origin. But now China is #1 in both export and import. So this declining significance of US as a trade partner had a significant impact on the status of South Korea-US alliance. And that may be one of the sources of anti-American sentiment, although survey after survey revealed that regardless age, party affiliation, or social class status, they don't express any outright anti-American sentiment. They do support South Korea-US alliance in general, but some left-wing media, progressive citizen groups do actively advocate anti-American sentiments. As I said earlier, we have next presidential election in less than 90 days. Lee Jae-myung, former governor of Gyeonggi province, is the nominee of Progressive Party, Democratic Party. As a former prosecutor general, Yoon Suk-yeol is running against Lee Jae-myung as the nominee of People Power Party, and then there are several other minor candidates. The Conservative Party candidate Yoon Suk-yeol had more than 10 percentage point lead in polls, but now it is neck and neck and tie. The approval rate, the rating is about the same. So it's going to be a very close race. The criticism against these two major candidates include the ethical and moral standards of Lee Jae-myung as a person, as well as a lawyer before he became mayor of Seongnam and governor of Gyeonggi province. He had serious problems with his brother, his the sister-in-law, and also media criticized Lee Jae-myung for representing a homicide case. One of the cases involved his nephew, and then Lee Jae-myung had this allegation, had to deal with the allegation of being involved in a land development scandal, multi-million-dollar pay-up scandal in this project. On the other hand, the Conservative Party candidate has been criticized for not having sufficient political leadership experience. Also, his family's involvement in stock market manipulation, another issue he would have to defend in the rest of the presidential campaign. Anyway, the race is quite close, and the race is turning into very much a negative campaign centered process, and therefore this manipulation of public opinion by SNS, internet use would have huge impact on the outcome of this presidential election. Okay, that's about all I have to say, and thank you very much for your attention, and I would be very happy to hear your observations, comments, and respond to your questions as well.
Yes, let's give Professor Shin a virtual round of applause for that informative talk on Korea's political demography. Now, let us proceed with the open forum. Again, you may type your questions at the Q&A box below, and you may also choose to be anonymous. So for our first question, we have several questions here, Professor Shin. For our first question from Troylan Calvario, good morning. I would like to ask, do you think that the issue of reunification with North Korea would be significant in the 2022 presidential elections? And if so, what will the role of silver vote have to do in pushing or not pushing such agenda?
A very important question. I'm glad that this question was raised. In the past political elections of South Korea, the ruling party would manipulate public opinion using this incident of rounding up North Korean spy ring in South Korea, and also reporting some anti-government movement organized by North Korean conspired or influenced the group. And some incidents near demilitarized zone would be exaggerated, and that kind of exaggerated report was used to alert voters and influence voters to support the ruling party and its candidate. Okay. On the other hand, the Progressive Party tried to push more engagement with North Korea. For example, President Kim Dae-jung came up with this so-called sunshine policy, in which he offered economic assistance for North Korea for humanitarian causes, and he proposed exchange programs of the cultural groups, performing groups, and so on, and visiting programs for separated families between South and North Korea. That kind of programs President Kim Dae-jung advocated, which went well for some period of time. But sunshine policy was backfired in that the economic assistance South Korea offered to Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, was diverted to nuclear power development and weapons for mass destruction development. So this generous, liberal, friendly reconciliation policy of Kim Dae-jung presidency is not that supported direction. On the other hand, South Koreans are concerned about this nuclear threat from North Korea. And Kim Jong-un has stopped the nuclear testing over the last 3.5 years, but his missile launching has been continuing. Therefore, if North Korea does continue some missile launching and other threatening behavior, it will have a negative impact on ruling party candidate, in my observation, because a conservative party tended to push for reciprocity, verification, and a very realistic approach in dealing with Pyongyang. Therefore, any even small indication of North Korean threat, the Conservative Party will use that as an excuse to push that South Korea needs stronger national defense, national security, and also stronger South Korea-US alliance. That kind of agenda they will try to advocate. Yes, North Korean behavior will be one of the possible major variable which will impact the outcome of next presidential election. And it depends on the nature of the North Korean threat. On the other hand, if Kim Jong-un surprise everybody by announcing some friendly policies for reconciliation between two Koreas, it will help government party candidate in that case. That would be my response to that question. Okay.
Hi, Professor Shin. There's another question related to that. Divulging as the political demographic profile of South Korea, are the dynamics of political and economic practices suggestive of emulation for development trajectory of democratic country like the Philippines?
Would you repeat the question again?
Yeah, I think considering the political demographic profile of South Korea, are the dynamics of political and economic practices suggestive of emulation for the development trajectory of democratic countries like the Philippines? This is a question from Mark Arevalo.
Okay, thank you for that question. And once again, it is a very important issue, not just from the standpoint of the academic investigation of political demography of South Korea or any nation state. My point here is the fact that this demographic transition is one major factor which any government measure cannot counter. Okay, it's like a river, water running. Some pundits call it the demographic cliff or demographic tsunami. When the demographic composition of population in a given society change drastically, no social force, no political measures could prevent the huge impact coming from that happening in the political development. We witnessed that from Arab Spring, the Jasmine Revolution. And it is likely to spread different countries in the world. And when it joins the economic process, the rise and fall of economic condition in that society, along with this demographic tsunami, then it will have the kind of the accelerated process of political change. So demographic transition in one hand and political development on the other. In between, the economic condition would play an intermediate role transmitting this demographic shifts influence on political outcome. And this dynamic interplay between demographic tsunami and economic condition would have unpredictable influence on political development. That would be my reaction to that comment. Okay. Thank you for that question.
Actually, he has a follow-up question here, Mark. Mark has a question. So, as to achieve the same status of being an industrial powerhouse in Southeast Asia, how does gender politics in your country could influence the emerging economies and young democracies in the region?
That's a very thoughtful observation, and I would like to indicate anecdote related to South Korean politics. As I said earlier, about 3.5 years ago, the Me Too movement got started in South Korea. And to attract the support for political agenda of the ruling party and President Moon and his administration. President Moon and his administration pushed the legislation for protecting the welfare and rights of women, particularly in the form of legislating the anti-crime bill against women, special legislation. And women's group organized mass demonstration on the street, pushing their cause. That was after a couple of tragic incidents that some young females got beat up in a kind of public bathroom in Gangnam district. So some new development of male hatredism emerged in that context. That had some significant backlash. Young males under age 30 felt they got alienated by President Moon and his administration. And they were experiencing tight job market condition and rising unemployment for college graduates. And so this young male voters who tended to support progressive party and supported President Moon, but they turned their back on President Moon and progressive party policies because of this pro-feminism policies President Moon and his administration pushed. So young South Korean male groups even proposed this unrealistic idea that let's require all young South Korean females serve in the military, just like young males have to. That's a kind of shocking proposal, but that kind of reaction, this young South Korean male groups manifested in reaction to that legislation pro-feminism oriented legislation President Moon and his administration adopted. So this gender dynamics, particularly among young age groups. The policymakers got to be very, very careful in handling them. Otherwise, it had a potential of huge fallout by alienating one group from and protecting other. That kind of split reaction we would experience. That would be my comment. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Shin. So I'll be combining two questions. So the first one is from Katrina Principe. So she's asking, do you think the upcoming presidential elections will be dominantly based on understanding and getting the support of the younger voting population, given that they're very active online? But the clarificatory question is, do they really participate when it's time to vote? On the other hand, Joseph Dison wants to clarify, how does regional politics affect the equal representation of the Koreans in government?
Okay, let me address to the second part of the question about the regionalism in South Korean politics. During the era of President Park Chung-hee, in 70s and 80s, his economic development policies offered lots of favors to his home region, southeastern region, to solidify his political support base. By doing so, he and his policies alienated the rival region, southwestern provinces. So one region benefited from this rapid process of industrialization and economic development, the southeastern region. On the other hand, southwestern region left behind. So when I was a college student, I traveled both regions. And in Busan, Daegu, and southeastern region, the highways were well paved, and they had this bullet train, rapid transit system from Seoul to Busan, Daegu, and on the other hand, the southwestern cities still had all the aged highways and poorly maintained. So you can tell this kind of discrepancy in the level of development of two regions. So many voters in southwest, so-called Honam region, felt they were alienated, discriminated, and shortchanged. Therefore, they voted against the ruling party throughout the history of South Korean election. Then President Kim Dae-jung got elected. His regional support base was the southwest, but he formed the alliance with the central region, so he was successful in presidential race. After he got elected, he tried to have equally distributed budget allocation for both south east and southwest. And since Kim Dae-jung's presidency in 2002, the southwestern region went through very rapid improvement in economic condition and job opportunities and so on. Although I would argue there is still a substantial regional inequality in the standard of living, family income, and employment opportunities, and so on. So this regional split in political orientation and voting behavior, one supporting Conservative Party, the other one supporting opposition party, will continue, although over the years, the regional animosity somewhat declined. I wanted to show my statistics, the index of dissimilarity in presidential election outcome. That would be my response to that regionalism question. Now, would you remind me the first part of the question? Novi?
I think somebody is asking about the participation of the youth, particularly on, do you think that the upcoming presidential elections will be dominantly based on understanding and getting the support of the younger voting population?
Thank you for reminding me that question. It's one of the most important variable in the forthcoming presidential election on March 9, 2022. As I showed through my PowerPoint slides, traditionally, voter turnout rate of 50 and older tended to be substantially higher than voters under age 50. Particularly, voters under age 30 would have a substantially lower voter participation rate than their older cohort members, but not anymore. Another interesting case related to this issue is the fact that there was this all the combination of voting pattern, the lower voting rate, yet larger absolute number of voters under age 40. But today in South Korean voting age population, because of this long and continuing decline of birth rate, the absolute size of voting population under age 30 shrank, whereas absolute size of 50 and older voters increased. So, and all 50 and older voters have a higher voting rate on top of the larger absolute size. So they have a 1-2 punch. On the other hand, younger voters, their absolute size is smaller than before, but one positive emerging pattern is the fact that their voter turnout rate has increased substantially. Therefore, it will cancel each other out. Now, younger voters' tendency of supporting a progressive party and its candidate is no guaranteed and assured voting pattern anymore. And as I said, this under age 30 voters, or even under 40, age 40 voters, they gonna be the critical voting bloc. How they vote would determine the outcome of the next presidential election. And even within that under age 40 voting bloc, as I said, females tended to be slightly in favor of progressive party, whereas the male counterpart showed a tendency of supporting opposition party. So the generation, gender dynamics of voting behavior became much more complex than ever before. And it's very unpredictable how they would vote in next presidential election. Thus far, the polls show that younger voters are not likely voting in great majority for ruling party candidate. And the 40-something voters in their 40s are very likely to vote for ruling party candidate. So and then 50 and older are likely to support conservative party candidate. But that's why it's going to be very close, too close to call, even near that time of actual election next March. That would be my response to that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shin. This is indeed a very informative and very comprehensive webinar. At this juncture, I would like to call on my partner to maybe share some of her insights related to the talk of Professor Shin.
Thank you, Narby. So during the talk, I was quite surprised to know that Park Geun-hye, if I pronounce it right, despite her historical background, a daughter of the dictator Park Chung-hee, was still elected as president and served from 2013 to 2017 in Korea. I've heard that she was involved in a corruption scandal, which led to her imprisonment. And I'm pointing this out because there is a possibility that something similar might happen in the Philippines. So everyone, please vote wisely in the 2022 elections. With regard to the internet politics, I agree with Professor Shin that social media plays a vital role, especially for authoritarian figures, because they can maneuver the public opinion through fake news and trolls. So let us make sure that we read from credible sites, right, Norby? So how about you? What are your insights?
Yeah, that's correct. I specifically like when Professor Shin discussed about the evolution of voters' roles, from traditional role audience to consumer, producer, even the ones delivering their political views and opinions via social media, as well as the confluence of politics and the rapid growth of the internet. Okay, at this juncture, may I call on Dr. Michelle R. Palumbarit, Associate Professor of the UP Asian Center, to deliver her closing remarks.
Thank you, Norby and Giselle, for excellently moderating this webinar. And of course, Professor Shin, as always, thank you for your very fascinating lecture. As a regular lecturer in the Korea classes of the Asian Center and a regular speaker to its webinar on Korea, Professor Shin has truly shared a lot of valuable knowledge and insights on Korea, and today is no exemption. So I hope that this is not the end of your interest in Korea. May this webinar further make you more curious about certain issues in Korea. And more importantly, may you relate Korea's experiences with ours here in the Philippines and extract lessons that can be learned from not only South Korea, but the entire Korean peninsula as well. So with that, Christmas is approaching. We from the Asian Center would like to wish you a meaningful year ahead. Thank you for coming, and stay safe, everyone. Professor Shin, Giselle, Norby, Janos, Princess, Mise, please stay for the group picture. Danae, can you please take our picture all together?
Yes, yes.
All participants, thank you for coming. Norby and Giselle, thank you. Professor Shin, thank you very much. Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate your support and attention. I must